we've not got that tall in order. We're doing infrastructure building for affordable medicines, and we got sent a brief. We're going to talk about, in the context of advances in science and the understanding of diseases, explore novel clinical trial methodologies, new approval routes, adaptation of regulation, and in the context of elements of complex health and socioeconomic components, work towards identifying some new financial models. So this is not that much really, is it, before here and lunch. So the way I'm going to do this, or suggest, is I'm going to ask the speakers to introduce themselves for 2 or 3 minutes to say, what brought them here and why they're interested in affordable medicines. And then I'm going to sort of have a question, grilling. I'm going to grill you on a few things. And I think, I don't want you to be a passive audience, so I'm not going to save my questions to the end. If we see a hand up and it's relevant, I'd like to sort of have the audience taking part as we go, so that it's not at the end. My background as an economist, so I'm thinking one of the things I should be doing is I should be interjecting a little bit of economic insight now and again, and I've also sort of made some notes to try and pull on the last day or two, so occasionally I'll pull in things that were said in the other sessions to see, So over to my three. There's Mark Taylor, Julie Walters, Sue Kilby. Maybe you could just have 2 or 3 minutes each explaining yourselves.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and to Harriet for inviting me here, and to Greg. I thought that was awesome. So I am the founder of Raremark, which is a bit like Patients Like Me, but in rare disease. So I think that is brilliant, and I've been trying to change the system for the last 10 years so that particularly patients, not necessarily patient group, but just patients can take part in changing the system. So I aggregate and anonymize patient data, we collect it online, we form communities of people with a rare condition because they're not recognized by their clinician, or even when they are. They have nothing to offer apart from saying, why don't you go home and spend what time you have left with your family? There's nothing that can be done. There's always something that can be done, it's just that their clinician doesn't know what it is. So we aggregate and anonymize the experience of the community and share it back with them. And I work with pharmaceutical companies all my life, so I completely understand the model and where it's broken and how it's siloed and the need for a new model.
Okay, that's cheating because you've gone on to my first question.
Hi, I'm Mark Taylor. I'm Head of Impact for the National Institute for Health Research. Although I have a number of hats, I'm part-time Head of Impact. I also do other stuff. I'm part of the British Medical Journal Patient Panel. I'm a trustee for Antibiotic Research UK. I am a patient advocate. I've had multiple sclerosis for 16 or 17 years now. And like a lot of people with MS, I have also multi-morbidities that are added to that. So I've become quite vocal over the past few years as a patient in that particular field, through things like being the outreach ambassador for Parkrun for multiple sclerosis. I don't know when anyone does parkruns here. Hands up in the air. None of you run? Fabulous. Massive fan of Parkrun. But some of these things overlap. So some of the work we're doing on impact assessment is seeing how we get the patient voice involved. But equally, we're doing a lot more work to try and get the Commissioner of Healthcare voice involved, something which I think is extremely important to get both those groups involved when it comes to looking at affordable medicine pathways. Okay, that would be me.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Sue Kilby, and I'm the chair of the Industrial Pharmacists Forum for the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. The Royal Pharmaceutical Society is actually a professional body. So we are, I head up a membership group for pharmacists who are working in industry. And that's right across from the large pharmaceutical companies through to consultancies and also pharmacists working in the digital and analytical fields as well. I've had somewhat of a mixed background. I started life in hospital, NHS, and worked there, then worked in community pharmacy. I have also worked in primary care, NHS England as well in recent years on their digital medicine strategy. I have worked for a range of pharmaceutical companies, both large global companies and small startup companies. And I've worked in consultancy and managed my own consultancies. And I've worked in diagnostics, devices and medicines as well. And I've had quite a lot of work with patient groups over my years. I took Rilitech through the NICE process, which is one of the early ones, and worked very, very closely with the MNDA. I've also worked in diabetes, and you can't work in diabetes without working closely with the DUK. And I worked, in fact, my position in the Cancer Networks was actually funded by Macmillan. And so I've worked closely with a whole range of cancer organisations as well.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everybody. I'm Andrew, I'm an economist. I got into global health on an affordability issue, and it was the pricing of HIV drugs in South Africa, 2002. And I was asked to, as an economist, look at the case being put by the companies and sort of tore it apart a little bit. And then, of course, now we look back and the companies think, well, why was 39 of us fighting in this case? It's, a complete different change in mindset.
They're still paying the price.
Still paying the price
Now
for
they're trying
reputation.
to fix sickle cell. So good luck with that one with the patient community.
Yeah. And up to date now, I'm working on biodiversity and medicine and working with groups in Brazil and Kew Gardens in India. And the last talk on blockchain was very pertinent to what I'm doing with those groups, because one of our parts of the solution to the problem is how to put natural products, in particular plant-based knowledge, inside a mechanism, blockchain possibly, because for all the talk about yesterday, somebody said, if you're talking about IP, you're not into the open science so much, but if you go and speak to Brazilian academics and political people, they need to know that who's going to control and have access and use this material. So the blockchain sort of is something we're playing around with in that context. Okay, system is broken.
Yes.
You said that.
Yes, it is.
What do the different speakers interpret as the main bits of the broken
What
system?
Greg was saying, that the people who have the biggest interest in a new treatment are not benefiting at all from the financial incentives. I mean, I'm not an IP lawyer. I didn't know that there was another way. So we're working within the system to help those. So at the moment, what we do as a service vendor, a bit like Patients Like Me, we aggregate data, patient data, and we sell it to pharmaceutical companies with the patient's permission, so that they can make drugs that patients actually want to use and are designed with the patient in mind. So that's how we make our money. What we're looking at now is to design new therapies where the patients actually have a stake. So you have gene therapies in rare disease coming to the market. The price is going to be between 1 million and 4 million a shot. One and you're done in sickle cell, which is being tested in America. But at the moment, none of the patient community will benefit from that. And they have little incentive to help contribute to their data, although they will. So I think it's absolutely crucial that patients benefit in actually the development of that new therapy. And you have some entrepreneurial patient groups like Cystic Fibrosis Foundation in the United States who have developed some of the early drugs and are still benefiting from that. So helping that whole economy circle round, so it's not just pharma that benefits financially. For me,
You're doing a brilliant job at predicting things I've got written on my paper, because I spotted two of you who've done a lot of work with patients, and there's been lots of reference to the importance of having patient voices and driving things. Mark?
I think the issue around patient voices I do find fascinating, because a lot of the language, though, still looks at patients as points of data. And obviously that's very important, but a lot of patient engagement work ends up being about getting bums on beds for clinical trials. Even when patients feel they're part of the process, they're part of someone else's process. And I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done on co-production with patients. There is some work by the James Litt Alliance in getting patient groups to help prioritise research, which I think is interesting. And there needs to be a lot more of that. However, research is still something done to patients overall, rather than with patients. Co-production is still a difficult concept for people to get around their heads. And in part that it's just structural. If an academic wants to do a piece of research and they apply for funds, the university will negotiate a contract on their behalf. The liability is within the university. If you have a patient co-signing, if I can use that particular term, or co-designing, they're not really co-production, because they're not really signing up to it in that sense, not really leading it in that sense. So the cognitive bias is still this is academic-led half the time. I don't have an answer for that. But I think there needs to be a lot more work in how we include patients in prioritisation research, on top of what NIHR has already done, but also including them in how we look at the impact of that research. So what do patients expect? What do they think success looks like? Because it might just surprise us.
Absolutely.
I did some work for a rare disease medical charity, which I don't think I can name, but it was on the research strategy. And I interviewed an awful lot of patients with that particular condition. And yes, they wanted a cure, but what they wanted more than anything else was respect, because it was a rare condition. And every time they went to the GP went, I've no idea. So they were looking for research to just give them a little bit of visibility. Now, when you talk about patient involvement, globally speaking, it's even more difficult, because there's a danger we will insert our models, which work well here, in places where, by definition, the model will have to be different. So we could be, if we're not careful, doing damage elsewhere. We need to think about this far more deeply, far more at the beginning of the process and throughout the process to make it a patient process, not a process with patients in it.
Can I throw a question? Gregory's left the floor, but is blockchain one way of incorporating patient engagement? Because you could, from the very word go, have the patient's sort of data and contract sort of built into the blockchain. He's disappeared, he's somewhere. Because there's a memory, isn't there, It isn't disappeared to 10 years down the road because there's been some sort of recording of it.
Right, it's provable in the blockchain and it will be there forever. So the key item there is that you want a third party to de-anonymize it, or to anonymize it rather, so it's compliant across jurisdictions. And then that can become part of a blockchain system in which all those patients that then upload their data, they're economically incentivized to do so, because every time a pharma company or third party or research university wants to mine that information, it will be provable that they're now accessing their data on a blockchain, and the patient could be paid out for doing that.
Okay. But it's critical it's be done in a way that's encrypted or confidential or something like this.
Yes, of course.
That's critical.
You can use weapons-grade cryptography to make that happen.
Okay.
But
that needs people to trust it, that it's happening.
If I may just comment on that, and to say pharma is one of the slowest industries to change. They have spent kind of the last 10 years moving from a paper-based consent at the trial site to doing it digitally. That's innovation. So I don't think this innovation will come from within pharma. They just can't do it. There's just too outside. So it will have to come from people like us outside the system who will then prove it. So as one example, there's a brilliant company out of America called Pear, which is Prescribed Digital Therapeutics, PDT. And you talk to the CEO of that, and he'll say he went to JP Morgan, which is like the healthcare conference in San Francisco, full of investors every year. And he'll say, it's a prescribed digital therapeutics. It's for cognitive behavior, but it's prescribed in the same way as a medicine. And all the investors, well, it never worked, never heard, won't work. Of course, then it got approved by the FDA. And now he goes to JP Morgan, and they all talk to him about it as if they invented it. Because it's a mad idea until it's proven. And this will not happen within existing structures. It will take entrepreneurs and dreamers and idealists and people with vision. And then they'll all come. I thought about it. I was miles ahead of it before Greg came up with it. I thought about it 20 years ago. That's what'll happen.
That's right on. So all you really need, though, because all the digital tools are essentially open source and available for anybody in this room to use. So all you really need is the patient record aggregation. You anonymize that, and then you put it into a repository, and that alone has tremendous value in and of itself. So.
Thank you.
I think one thing which is really important is to remember that patients are different. I mean, we talk about patients as one person, but they're not. They are very different. And what I would want would not necessarily be the same as what you want. And what we're prepared to put up with is variable and very different. And I think this is really important to actually bring this out in the research that's actually undertaken. Because one of the key things, and pharmaceutical companies want this, is for people to actually take their medicines. Because, there's a lot of money that's actually wasted in actually developing products that are never used and never prescribed. But the money is also wasted in products which are prescribed are never taken. And it's really important to actually understand what is important for people. It's not patients, it's people. What do you actually want? What do they want? And actually, you've got to look at it, and it will vary from individual to individual. And some people will want one thing, and some people will want something completely different. I have had quite a few friends who have unfortunately developed cancer. And sometimes there are the most amazing, wonderful drugs that are actually available. But actually, they have decided they do not want to take that medicine because there are side effects associated with that product. Mm-hmm. And actually, they would rather have a better, shorter, good quality of life than a longer, potentially poorer quality of life. And those are the sort of things that we need to have individual conversations. And that's why it's really important to involve healthcare professionals, and I know you've already mentioned this several times this morning, and commissioners involved in studies early on, so that you can start to learn to understand as to what is important and what is clinically significant for individuals and for the healthcare economy.
Good, thank you. Can we turn to the bit about advances in science and understanding of disease and how we're moving away from a world where you sort of just lump all the patients together and you try to develop a disease, an intervention that benefits the most, harms the fewest and all the rest. So you've got all these new technologies, and Jeremy was listing them this morning. And it seems to me that some of them are pointing in the direction of more affordability and some of them less affordability, and the conference is about affordability. So we had the cell-based discussion yesterday. So we had a wonderful speech about cell-based and how the trial sizes can be quite small. And I went up after and said, does that mean this will be cheaper to develop products? Yes. And then there's we see DNA sequencing getting cheaper and cheaper. So there's lots of things that say this is getting more and more affordable, and yet we also get these big numbers and big figures. So what bits of the sort of ecosystem are driving affordability downwards, and which bits might be helping it go upwards? Because there are bits that are becoming, cheaper and cheaper, and data and digital stuff is one of the parts of that equation. But maybe it isn't. Some people say there's too much data, it becomes proliferative and expensive and hard to do it.
I mean, I would say that medicines, it's difficult to look at affordability if you just look at the medicine. So if we talk about sickle cell gene therapy, so we've just done a survey of our patient population with sickle cell, both in the United States and in the UK. In the United States, they're in the emergency room at least 6 times a year, uncontrolled vaso-occlusive crises. They're also at least with their primary care physician or their hematologist once a month. That's costing a lot of money. One patient was at the emergency room 24 times a year. Hideous for the patient, for the person with sickle cell. Hideous for the emergency room staff who have to deal with somebody in a vaso-occlusive crisis where the sickle cells get stuck in their veins. One and you're done. Sickle cell gene therapy coming soon, NIH trial. Price, Novartis, varies between 1 and 4 million. But you're done.
Okay.
Assuming it works. So you have to balance the cost of that one-time admission with that person who's received that gene therapy will no longer be in the emergency room 4 to 25 times. Can I flick
you on that one, sickle cell disease, Africa? I mean, I remember going in a ward in a emergency room in a hospital in Africa, and there was a 9-year-old boy just lay there with the cloth over. He died because of the issues. So you think, okay, so if you had an intervention,
right,
but you just came up with a big price tag, 4 million or something. Right. I'm going, well, how's this going to square? Because this is the access thing as well as the affordability thing.
So there are other companies working on that.
How do these guys get it?
So there are companies working on it. We don't know what the answer is yet, but it probably may not come from the traditional players.
Okay.
I think and this is very NHS based, so apologies for talking about this in terms of global health. We need to define what we mean by affordable in that sense. So again, I bore people about this, but 2/3 the cost of a lot of chronic conditions are outside a healthcare system.
Yeah.
I have MS. 2/3 of the costs are outside the NHS. A lot of the costs will be within social care. It's the cost of how much I can earn because I can't work the hours I used to work. It'll fall on my family. So, in many ways, we need to look at the economic evaluators. Within the UK, a lot of the world, we talk about qualities. Well, is that actually the best way of looking at it? The reimbursement system, do they actually work? Now, it doesn't answer the 1.4 million per patient question, but an awful lot of costs and conditions, if you look more broadly outside the healthcare system and reimbursement more broadly, you might get a better answer or a more affordable answer because of the long-term effects overall. I think we just need to think in a manner which is patient-based rather than system-based.
Okay.
I've got a couple of comments, really. One is actually making sure that the right patient gets the right medicine at the right time. And then, as I've already said, in making sure that they actually take it as well. Because certainly, if it's never used, then that's a total waste to the whole system.
If you get hold of a recent National Geographic on the future of medicine, they had a photographer go and get people to empty their cabinets of drugs. And the first sort of 10 pages are, this is the drugs contents of the cabinet of, and some of them have filled a room with this stuff, which they've bought and never used, or been prescribed it and never used it.
Well, I mean, in the UK, NHS England, there is a big drive to obviously reduce polypharmacy.
Yeah.
And I mean, a lot of medicines that are coming through, it's a case of also having companion diagnostics as well that are available to identify the patient. So I think it's not just a case of doing the work on the actual molecule, but it's actually how can you make sure you identify the right patients. The other issue is actually getting patients through the system quick enough to actually receive the treatment. We are also very much into preventative medicine as well. So if we can prevent conditions developing in the first place, then you don't need to actually treat those conditions. But we will still always have some patients that will need to be treated. So we will always have to be able to afford it. We know the ABPI has really recently come out with their new voluntary scheme as well to try and control the profits that are made by the pharmaceutical industry as well. So there are various measures that are actually in the system currently to try and manage that.
Can you unpick that preventative bit a bit in terms of affordability? There's a guy in Oxford, Chris Dye, was giving a talk saying how little money we actually spend on prevention. It's always, we put the money in the curative. If we think of where some of these new technologies are going, part of the affordability thing, and it comes to your measuring impact thing, is that they're going to be preventive technologies. But what are first of all, what are the sort of regulatory issues and the development issues of those kind of technologies? And are there incentives in our current business models for that? I mean, is prevention always very profitable? Sometimes it's much more profitable not to prevent, or...
You may be right. However, I mean, in cancer, there's been quite a lot of work that's actually been done to try and prevent people developing cancer in the first place. And Public Health England as well is obviously very keen to reduce obesity, for example, because that's well known, well documented that you're at higher risk of developing certain conditions. But it is difficult, and you're trying to change practice, aren't you? I mean, it's difficult enough to change healthcare professionals' practice, but to change the population as a whole, their practice. But we have seen some changes. We've seen the number of people smoking maybe reducing over time. So it is possible. But there are costs associated with actually doing that. I mean, there's a lot of work that has to be done around education. Yes,
you guys are so good at predicting where this is going. But if you think of, Jeremy was talking this morning about, how we had some sort of naivety about how quickly things could have their impact through the system, and you think, and TB drugs, we ended up realizing you can't just presume that people will take them. It's the same with malaria. Lots and lots of developing countries, you realize that there's curious treatment of drugs. You just buy one pill for malaria and you don't take the full course, et cetera, et cetera. So that's part of the equation that we perhaps we'll talk about later a bit, education and so forth. Can you guys explore a little bit some of the regulatory issues that we were asked to talk about in terms of some of these novel or developments that are going on in science? In terms of, for example, if you think of regulatory roadblocks, we had a conversation yesterday saying we praise people who are innovative and they break the mold, but then we should go back and say, well, why did they have to break the mold? What was it that was blocking that they needed to be a hero, as it were?
I mean, I can talk about gene therapy.
Yes,
because
that'd be
in
good.
rare disease, the vast majority of conditions are monogenic, so caused by a single gene mutation. And so there's a huge opportunity. The US regulator, the FDA, expects there to be, we have 4 approved gene therapies now, and we expect there to be hundreds in the next 10 years, because we now have, I graduated in molecular genetics 20 years ago, and we thought we were going to be on the cusp of the genetic revolution then. But we didn't have the tools, we didn't have the viral vectors that were ready. And now we have all these people online and the tools to actually be at the cusp of, and I was at a gene therapy conference in Boston 2 weeks ago, and I think the UK has an opportunity to vie with Boston to be the world's epicenter for gene therapy. So in Boston, there were 500 people in the room, the pioneers of gene therapy. There are 100 gene therapy companies in Boston right now. Because we have, whether you agree with it or not, we have a financial mechanism to get it through. And we've seen some of the early success of companies. So nobody has the answer. So for example, you have a viral vector, injected. How are we going to measure neutralizing antibodies? Don't know. Don't really know. But these companies are moving forward. They're getting funded, and other companies that are going for funding with more small molecule, more repurposing, the investors are saying, you got anything in gene therapy? So the whole market, particularly where I spend a lot of time, is interested in gene therapy, and it's partly driven by that price tag. Which is only going to get higher.
Can I ask you on this using therapies that become very personalised, is this also driving costs upwards to some degree? I mean, we've had a few examples where in the talks, very small groups getting very specific and $500,000. I mean,
the one in the United States that's setting the agenda in terms of pricing is called ICER, I-C-E-R. They have no teeth, but they are informing the entire gene therapy market. They are using NICE's system of QALYs and how to decide. And they have set a threshold. If it's an ultra orphan, you can charge more. And if it's not an ultra orphan, you can charge less. Now, industry is kind of having to go on its knees to ICER now, because ICER has it's got the ear of the regulator. So there is a little regulation, but not that much.
Okay.
Yes. I think it's very difficult when you bring new entities through, because sometimes the regulatory system lags behind the developments of the new products. I mean, it was set up, MHRA, EMA, to do, dare I say, traditional pharmaceuticals. But now with the digital and combinations as well, and it's always been slightly difficult when you've had a product which is both a medicine and a device, and that trying to get it approved. And I think that's why it's really important to let the regulators know as early as possible when you're actually developing new entities, so that the systems can be put in place to actually ensure that whatever is developed is actually safe to actually use. Because the last thing anybody wants to do is actually create additional problems for patients and additional costs for the healthcare systems as well, because they have to pick up the management of people that have developed side effects as a result of some of the treatments. And so we were talking back about affordability, and that is all part of the overall costing and working out of what is affordable and what can you actually afford. But I agree with you, the regulatory side in some cases may have appeared to be behind. I mean, there are various fast track systems in place. We are in a position, and we don't really know, and I'm sure you've discussed it many times in this conference, over Brexit.
Came up once or twice.
Yes. I mean, we have the FDA, we have the EMA.
Yeah.
We're also going to then have our own system as well, maybe,
because we've
with
lost
the MHRA.
to Europe and so on.
And that will have created, well, we know it's created significant problems, haven't we? Because the MHRA did a lot of the work for the EMA. And depending how we leave, it may be difficult in the short term for some of the people working at the MHRA to actually lead on some of the work at the EMA. I don't know.
Okay. Do you think institutionally sometimes we get into what economists will sometimes call hysteresis? We end up with a system that's sort of stuck in the way it is, and it almost needs a shock to knock it out. And when novel technologies come along that are a bit sort of disruptive, it takes a while for the system to gravitate to this new. Is there anything we could do to knock the system more quickly?
Well, that's why I think
it's part of the job, I suppose, of conferences like this.
We need to talk to the people that are actually going to be regulating and assessing early on. And
Mark, yeah.
But there is some work. There's a paper by the Health Foundation that came out October last year, which talked about implementation of innovation back into a healthcare system. And it was very, very interesting because, obviously you need policy, you need top down. But they were sort of saying that implementation happens when you have this guerrilla grouping of specific patient groups and allied health professionals. Because without them shouting, screaming, dragging, poking with a stick, policy is irrelevant. So unless you have those guerrilla groups pushing, pulling, nothing will ever change. So actually, I agree with you. Systems do get stuck. Cultures become stuck by definition. And no matter what your strategy is, cultures always crack on strategy. So unless you have that guerrilla campaign for drug A, condition B, service C, things will either not change or not change enough fast enough. Talking about genetic treatments, therapies is wonderful, but they're always going to be expensive. They're going to be expensive for a while. Whereas 2 or 3 times today, we've already talked about repositioning of drugs. And in many ways, for affordable medicine, that's a much more interesting discussion. What Gregor was talking about, I think, is key. Looking at things that can be put back in phase 2 to see where they go is a lot more powerful in the short term, specifically, than anything else. But for the long term, unless we engage with commissioners, the correct patient groups, whatever that means, and allied health professionals down the chain, nurses, therapists, because any technological innovation has a service innovation attached to it by definition. If you look at this entirely as in there's a new drug, there's a new treatment, there's a new machine, without taking into account the service innovation and how that will disrupt the healthcare pathway itself, you've lost. You've lost before you start.
So this is a reminder that at the table you need people who study management, governance, all these other things.
Yeah.
Can I ask you guys about data, proliferation of data? I mean, a lot of the stuff that we were discussing, the new stuff, technologies that are coming along, are generating tons and tons of data. And I read something that a study, Stanford University, says that between 2013 to 2020, the amount of health data generated will go from 153 exabytes to 2,314 exabytes. Do you know what an exabyte is? I didn't. I had to read what it was. It's a very, very large. So but it's growing exponentially.
Yes.
Now, so my question is this good or bad? I mean, is big data the answer to everything? A lot of this technology is becoming very number crunching. Are there downsides as well as upsides to this in terms of managing it, regulatory systems that can cope with it, patients who understand it, trials that can use it?
Yes.
I mean, what's the limit to all this?
You need to explain data in a way that normal people can understand. And if you explain it in a way that I'm a journalist by training with a degree in molecular genetics. So I think if you just use a language that normal people can understand, they're more than capable of understanding. More than capable. You just have to, under GDPR, which is a fantastic European data privacy regulation, fantastic. Be clear, use the data for the purposes which it was given. That's broadly it. Okay, so do that. But actually, I think the bigger challenge is that most of the big data sets, if you look at somebody like IBM Watson, they spend 80% of their time cleaning up the data so it can be used. That's the biggest challenge. In rare, it's easier because we have beautiful, precise data sets for 500 people. If you do that in diabetes, much, much harder. So, it's easier for me.
Can I make a comment here?
Yes.
One of the problems that we have at the moment in the UK is that we don't have electronic prescribing throughout all the hospitals at this present point in time. And therefore, we collect some data, but we have gaps in the data. And the data sources that we have at the moment are imperfect. The more data that we have, the more analytics we need as well. Mm-hmm. And I'm far from certain that we have actually the capabilities or the capacity to manage all the analytics at the present point in time. Mm-hmm. So there's no point in having data unless we can change it into some sort of useful information to inform what we're actually doing.
Do you think, having said that the data and all this proliferation of data has a long-term ability to pull down, make things affordable, better targeted? There's an economic equation in there that says it can make more efficient allocation. Mark, do impact stuff.
I mean, there is a danger actually and I agree actually that with both you, data is dirty until proved otherwise, if that makes sense, incomplete until proven otherwise. Engaging with patients, I think, is a very useful way forward. I think actually more needs to be done because a danger is that the data becomes distrusted. Now, we've seen this in the UK when people have talked about using patient data and there's an uproar because of a headline in one of the tabloids. There needs to be a lot more work engaging the public to almost create data connoisseurs. So bear with me, say, the world of wine and food, you have people who review restaurants and wines. They don't own a restaurant, they don't have a vineyard, but we trust their judgment. Within films and theatre, we have people like Mark Kermode. Mark Kermode is a brilliant film critic for anyone who listens to his podcast. He doesn't make films, but we trust his judgment. As data becomes more prolific, as the use becomes more important, perhaps we need to grow a cohort of data connoisseurs. They're not data experts, but they're people who we trust, who, because they seem to understand what's going on and seem to be like us, rather than in an ivory tower, when they say this is a good thing, that helps calm everyone down that it's not going to be misused, our data. We may have to use things like citizens' juries to get people on board. The Northern Health Science Alliance, through their Connecting Data Cities program, ran 2 citizens' juries to make sure the way they were going to use data for certain projects would have broad acceptability, to understand the parameters in which patients and public would agree to their data being used. It's expensive, but the benefit to the NHSA and their program was it had buy-in before they started. Everything went wrong, they could say, no, we have actually properly consulted people who will be affected by this. It's an expense, but we do have to think about that within the work we do when it comes to data collection.
Okay, cool. I'm getting signs that lunch is kind of approaching, but can we have 5 or 10 minutes, or would you? There's more questions, but if there's a few from the floor, that might be quite nice. And I'm quite interested in sort of funding models, and the bit about new finance, I think, was the more sustainable financial models, and why aren't we investing more, and the sort of the vision part of this.
Yes, on this issue of data, I just attended a breakfast recently. The problem with a lot of the data is, first of all, it comes in different formats, it's not consistent, it's not curated, it's really difficult. Big data is really difficult to use. Yeah. So I think that you have to keep that in mind. It's coming from all sorts of different sources in different ways. So unless we set down standards as to how this data has to be collected and how it's curated, et cetera, it will always be less than useful in that respect. The only data we do get, which is relatively useful, is more in the small data area, which is, sort of chemoinformatic data, like Kemble, which is, and PubChem, which are curated, or things like the Cancer Atlas, or other data sets like GEO, which are really quite consistent, and therefore are usable, even if they also have false positives and negatives in them, but they still are relatively usable. And with machine learning, you can extract information from them. Okay, just wanted to make that.
Hi, I'd like to make a comment on infrastructure and how we're maybe not making best use of resources, particularly for gene therapy. So the National Blood Transfusion Service, as you probably know, is a massively brilliant centre for advanced cell therapeutics and is developing gene therapies. Why, if it's a public good, are we not investing there? Instead of paying Novartis £4 million a shot for a sickle cell gene therapy, why aren't we counting up how many patients need that therapy, multiplying it by the cost that Novartis will charge, and maybe investing that in the infrastructure we already have to make it a public good?
And to just be clear, Novartis hasn't set the price.
Okay, fine.
But other people have suggested what the price might be, and it is between $1 and $4 million a go.
But would it cost that much if it was done publicly?
Well, I think just one thing to bear in mind is that the pharmaceutical world is driven by the US. The UK is a very small country at the edge of Europe. So increasingly, you have some great, I'm Australian by background, I'm a British passport now. I'm sorry, I thought I was a European. Sorry, I'm just British. And, you know, there are great key opinion leaders here. There are great people you can get your name on a paper. That's the UK. They're not going to come here to help them understand how to do their pricing model. It's going to be set in the United States, always.
Why can't we have an NHS pricing?
We do.
Do through nice.
Exactly, but not for companies.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd like to take the point about pricing. We're talking about affordable medicines. We are all talking about how much it costs to develop. That perhaps a fantasy, you know, it's aggregation of numbers. But what really dictates the price is what the market can pay. We all know that, isn't it? And many of the costs that like the one you mentioned, 4 million, that's the compounded cost of how much this person would cost in NHS, etc. But again, that is a big fallacy because we're based on the cost of a model that's already making losses. We cannot build on that premises. Now, what are the thinking about actually reverting it? Remember the longitude challenge. Governments can set together a top price to be paid per patient. And it has to be a concerted effort because if we set one price here and the company find a better market, well, why should I say sell in the UK? You're right, right? So can we think about this kind of effort? Because then at least that will focus many different organizations to say, okay, this is the top money I can get, and here's how much I want to invest in that discovery. If I'm good enough, I'll make it. If I'm not, well somebody else will.
But just think on that conversation, which is a great idea, who is in the room when the price of the Novartis drug is set? Who's in the room? The manufacturer, Novartis, and the payer in the United States. The payer in the United States might be Harvard Pilgrim. So they run hospitals and they're an insurer. That will be a conversation between Novartis and Harvard Pilgrim. And that conversation will go on for 2 years. In the United States, most people stay with one insurer for 1 year, and then they flip to another one, and then they flip to another one. So the insurer is worried about, if I'm going to be a hit for like $4 million in year one, that just doesn't make any sense. So let's drag it out over 10 years, and then let's have some value-based outcome metrics so that actually this patient is no longer in the system so that's the conversation, and government is not in the room.
I mean, we have a sort of a case with cystic fibrosis, the Arcambi Vertex drug, that they wanted 105,000 for it, and NHS was negotiating, per patient, but they put the deal on the table, $500 million over 5 years, the biggest this is, and they've just destroyed 8,000 doses. They just couldn't come to an agreement, even though they put a big sum of money on the table. It's not a...
It's a pressure tactic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Look, guys, we're destroying this pill, so your kids cannot have it because your government is not paying for it.
Yeah.
But we're not engaging people who are invested, interesting, and are we expecting too much of the government, perhaps? Really? Right?
Well, possibly. I mean, governments change on a fairly regular basis. Health policy evolves over time. The structures which commission healthcare change when governments change from one type to another. It is quite difficult to track. It's not impossible, but we need to take that into account. And a lot of the time we don't. People get frustrated, they don't even try because it's too difficult. Well, it's not obviously too difficult, but it is challenging. And we don't map out far enough ahead about what may or may not happen. We don't engage with the right people. It's why I waffle on about engage with commissions of healthcare. Their structure may change. In the UK it was PCTs, it's now CCGs and NHS England, but the people tend to stay the same. They just tend to change their business cards.
I mean, we do have obviously commercial agreements with the NHS, which is separate to the list price, because the whole issue is that the list price in UK is being used as reference prices for other parts of the world as well. So that is one of the difficulties. So there is the list price and the agreement with the NHS as to what's being paid.
Did you have a...
No, just leaning forward.
Okay. So.
Very interesting discussion, and I think it's easier to bring out particularly impressive examples of single gene disorders and great successes that we have there, but let's not forget that because of regulatory lags, because of the regulatory bar going down so far, to try to bring innovation, we bring to market tremendous amount of products that are very suboptimal. More than 50% of products are Me Too's, and they cost outrageous amounts of money. Cancer drugs cost over $100,000 per year, and they're not sickle cell drugs where we can actually wonder at how amazing that particular product works. Even with our Combi, fascinating discussion, and it's been everywhere in Guardian, it's a life-saving drug. Is it a life-saving drug? We have no data. I mean, Vertex hasn't provided it. I think it's helped some people, but the rhetoric and hype around it is just unprecedented. And I think we're in a very difficult position here where for extremely expensive therapies, when decisions cannot be reached, we do have compulsory licensing, which many countries use, and this is your example to try to develop a product internally. But what do we do with these buckets and buckets of, I wouldn't want to use the word useless, but very, very suboptimal products, and they might actually be useful to some subgroups of patients. We never know, because they're never studied, because pharmaceutical industry will not provide those drugs to be studied later on to generate proper randomized data, not data from registries. It's fine to have a registry for orphan disease. I'm more than happy with that data, but not when we go into murkier spaces. So, and the very difficult situation becomes, what do you do with those products? And when NICE says no to a product, patients are picketing in front of the NICE offices. For some reason, they're not going to the Vertex office and picketing there because they don't completely understand the system. And they got to be careful, because from the patient's perspective, most patient organizations are funded by the industry or have a very high proportion of that funding. And you can understand patients, because if they turn against the industry, who do they turn to? Because it's the industry who may have the drug for them, and they may have that sickle cell therapy that may save them, and they may screw them. But at the same time, financially, or just they may not give it access. But we live in a system of absolute monopolies or oligopolies where we have these cartels of drug pricing. And patients have no option. They are locked in the system where they cannot turn to a public drug developer and say, there is a solution. Can we have hope here? Mm-hmm. So.
Thank you. We're out of time.
Yeah.
Okay. Brilliant. Well, we can.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.